Yes.
Well, thanks very much, Yehuda. This is extremely interesting. But I can sort of see why, as you say, this interpretation is not very popular. So the idea of service of God is a joke, and it's a joke, service of God. Anything we can do, sacrificing, Abraham sacrificing his son, being willing to do that, or being willing to devote our total lives to the service of God, it's all a joke, because God is so far above us. But if God is as far above us as all that, if God is so utterly transcendent, so that you might say his picture is empty, nothing, well, then it seems as if it wouldn't matter what one did. Why wouldn't it be just good to say, jeer at God? Or why wouldn't it be just as good to, in some totally different way, to say, pursue pleasure or fame or whatever? I mean, if God is so utterly transcendent, we don't get any, I mean, it doesn't look as if it doesn't have any bearing on our lives. He no longer, and his commands of life no longer have any bearing on our lives. Maybe just as soon that we would ignore all his commands or do the opposite.
Okay, let me take each step at a time. First, I want to just clarify what I might have clarified, is that the fact that the sacrifice is aborted is what's crucial here. That is, that the sacrifice does not go through, and he's being taught that this is the fact. Now, the question you're asking is a very large question, and I think it's a difficulty for Reb Nachman. I've addressed it in a paper of mine, which was published this past year in the journal called Modern Judaism. And I think that Reb Nachman, I think there's a difficulty there. I cannot go into it now, but I'd be glad to give you a copy of that paper to see. I would say that I think at this level, there are two things to say. First of all, Reb Nachman has a whole piece where he discusses questions that have answers and questions that do not have answers. There are two kinds of questions. And one of the questions doesn't have an answer. Apparently, for Reb Nachman, is the problem of evil. Doesn't have an answer. I don't think he was looking for a defense, but for an actual explanation for the evil. And so he recognizes questions that have no answers. He also was very strong on what he called pshuta emunah, plain faith, where you don't ask questions of this sort, and you follow the faith just as in tmimut, in simpleness. Now, all of these things mask these kinds of questions that you're asking. I think there's a problem here, and in that paper I tried to address it to a certain degree. There's a very great emphasis in Reb Nachman, as there is in Kierkegaard, I think, to a certain extent, but with certain bit of a different emphasis, of purity of heart, which I mentioned a few times. Now, I mentioned that word with Kierkegaard in mind, the purity of heart, where Kierkegaard talks about the purity of heart being able to will one thing. So I'm going to beg off of going through that into any great detail, just to note that I think that question does arise. I think Reb Nachman deals with it, or tries to deal with it in different ways. And I'll give you that paper to look. Okay. Yeah.
I really haven't studied, I mean, I shouldn't say I really haven't studied Nachman. I haven't studied Nachman at all. I never even heard of him until just now. So I really don't propose to speak authoritatively on him and his condition.
Okay.
But if what you're interested in is purity and simplicity of heart, then suggesting that living in this fashion, as Abraham did, is a joke, seems to me not the way to do it. That seems very sophisticated, ironic.
Yeah.
Well beyond simple faith, simple purity of heart.
There are a number of things to say here. First of all, Reb Nachman says elsewhere that for the masses we teach kvodo malei olam. His glory fills the whole world. For the wise man, the saying is ayeh mekom kvodo. Where is his glory? So that this theme reappears at different places in Reb Nachman. The highest level the wise person can get to is to say, where is his glory? Namely, the glory is beyond, is not in the world. The masses can see the glory in the world, or experience that glory in the world. So this is a theme which I think comes back again and again in several places in Reb Nachman's teaching. And there is a place where there is a turn, I think, where he wants to go back to the simple life. In other words, the simple life being you keep the commandments, you serve God, knowing somehow or some way, perhaps we would call it existentially, that's a good word that gets around all difficulties, right? Existentially, that this is a comic in the end. Okay, you're asking the right question. I mean, this is a man who was greatly, I would say, agitated by such issues, precisely these kinds of issues. He was not so much a teacher who was teaching doctrine as one who was living through the conceptions and the experiences that he had. So these are exactly the right questions, but I think there's enough in Reb Nachman to say this is what he was after. These are the kind of things he was after to say. Yes?
I'm wondering why you call this a comedy in two acts. It seems like, I mean, in a sense, you could have just as well called it a tragedy in two acts. I mean, you could say the picture is sort of a tragic picture of this enormous and unbridgeable gulf between mankind and God, and anything that we can do is sort of, a ridiculous attempt to even try to bridge that gulf, and there's no reconciliation that's possible. The portrait's empty. Isn't it almost a tragic vision as much as a comic vision?
No. That is, it depends what you do with it. Someone could take this as a tragic vision, which is exactly how Hegel saw it. And therefore he thought that there was great pain and unhappiness at the very heart of Judaism. It depends what you do with it and how you react to it. If you get up off the floor and you say, well, what counts now is purity of heart, to declare God's utter otherness in everything that we do, this gives the meaning to it, and to do this in the kind of comic spirit is all that can be done, but that is enough. I mean, not only that can be done, but that is the supreme thing. In other words, it depends how you look at it. It depends what you do with it. And I think in a certain sense, use the word again, it's an existential question, whether you stay with that and that's the end of the story, or you see the possibility of going further. I wouldn't exactly compare it to the rolling the stone up the hill and rolling it down. But again, even there, right? It depends, how you see it, or if you take certain Zen Buddhist conceptions. So I don't think that the situation is such that it requires a tragic reaction. And I think what we could get, perhaps I'm not elaborating it enough, but at least to put on record, I think that the situation is such that it makes possible different reactions. So that Reb Nachman was able... Of course, comedy here is ironic, right? It's not a comedy, but he's saying it... The word comedy I took from him, who says it's a joke. And by a joke, he didn't mean, you're falling off with laughter. But what he meant was that it's absurd. But to really live that absurdity can be something very powerful and very meaningful, and the end being your way of giving homage to God. Look what I'm doing. I'm keeping the Sabbath. I'm eating only kosher food, right? Which, in one sense, is just aside from any other side things it does, but doesn't bring one any closer to God. But I'm eating kosher for knowing that it's comic. But in knowing that it's comic, I declare, the utter, infinite greatness of God in that way. And my short answer is, I think it's how you take it. It doesn't have to be tragic. But I expected that reaction from this audience. Sam.
Tom, and then Al, and way in the beginning, Henry's question. So, bringing this Kierkegaard bit in, right? So, here's another way of reacting. This seems to be a way of reacting once I come to this, and I'm not yet seeing why we should react in the comic way as opposed to this other way, the infinite resignation way, right? Where they're kind of give it all up and say, to hell with it. God's that far removed from me. Why even bother keeping to go through the rituals? Why? And so I see that, you could go different ways with this realization of the picture between me and God. What I'm not quite seeing yet on this account is, why I should go the one way rather than the other. Is there anything internal to when I learn about how God is this far from me that would prompt me towards the comic as opposed toward the infinite resignation or the tragic or whichever other model?
Only, okay? My guess is that this way, Reb Nachman's way, is to live that realization. To live that realization every moment of your life. It's not just a conceptually recognizing it and then forgetting it, but you live that realization. You live that from moment to moment. We have laws which govern our existence from the moment we wake up in the morning to the moment we go to sleep at night. So you live this realization. Imagine having this comic sense about, as you go through the day, is to realize it and to live it and to deepen it. Now, I'm not sure that's enough of an answer, but that would be an important difference between the two reactions.
I completely see and agree with that. That's certainly one way to do it. And I can sort of imagine what that would be like. But I can also imagine really living out this realization in a kind of infinite resignation way, where suddenly the sort of meaning structures that one imposed on the world, we suddenly saw how far short they fell of anything that was substantial. And you sort of live in a very resigned way, very much living this out in a real authentic, existential, whatever that means, way. I could see doing that too. And so again, I don't yet see why I should do one rather than the other, just from the realization that I need to live this out.
Let me think. Let me think more on that, okay? Yes, Lucy. I want to thank Lucy, by the way, for all that she's done for me since I arrived in August. And
I do it ironically. I guess it's part of what he said. I don't see how you can sustain practices and obediences, etc., ironically, for very long. I mean, it seems to me psychologically, spiritually, it just wouldn't work. And I don't get it. I mean, it seems to be obedient, ironically, is not to be obedient. Or to pray, ironically, is not to pray.
Well, you're in Rav Nachman's spirit, because he says we pray as though we pray. And we study as though we study. So in a certain sense, I would co-opt what you're saying. But I have found there are some times in my own practice that I find this to be very edifying, very helpful. What the hell am I doing? There's something. I see. Okay. Yeah. Okay, I can appreciate that. I can see it more, perhaps, but I can appreciate that you might not see that. 1 minute, Michael. Let's see if anybody else had a question. Yes. Go ahead. You.
Sounds a lot like other things people are saying. I'm not really sure if there's another thought here, but so I'll ask the question and then I'll guess your reply. It doesn't seem sensible to me to engage in behavior that you think is a joke or pointless or something. And so after I've made this realization that certain religious practices are a joke or pointless or whatever, it doesn't seem like I can sensibly engage in those things if I see them as having no point or pointless. And then I'm expecting your reply to be like, oh, well, there is a point. The point is to sort of live out the realization. And I'm just finding that I just don't understand how to live out the realization that what I'm doing is pointless by engaging in pointless activity. That seems dumb.
Okay. The answer is we have to distinguish between pointless and pointless. In one sense, it's pointless in the sense that it doesn't get you close to God. So its pointlessness is there. But in another sense, at a different level, it's completely full of point. In fact, it is the supreme act that you can do. Its point is that you, by doing it and by knowing that you're not getting to God with this, you are declaring and realizing and making concrete in your life the fact of God's utter infinity. So so you don't say to yourself, this is pointless. What you say to yourself is you find the meaning in it, precisely in declaring, of realizing that inability to get to God. But you live it and you do it constantly.
So what's added by actually engaging in pointless one-sense practices than just considering and reflecting and meditating on the transcendence of God or something like this?
Well, here I think is a real something very Jewish about this position, that Judaism has always stressed, I'll put it in a Christian way, the carnal in practice, and the benefits of the carnal in practice, and of that creating the proper relationship to God. So I think this is very much in that tradition. This set in the Jewish context, this makes a lot of sense. Set in the context of monastic life, it wouldn't, for example. Yeah. Well, one last question for Professor Signer.
No, I just wanted to also lift up something in the framework you gave us today that I think helps us understand the irony of this. And that is, in looking at the rabbinic system, which is one of command and response, there is a tendency sometimes to look upon it as if God really needs this. And I think one of the things that Reb Nachman talks about is our recognition that what we do is not necessarily needed by God. And therefore it's not a mechanistic system in which God is the cosmic vending machine rewarding us for being obedient. But it's exactly the reversal. It's the recognition that God is infinite, doesn't need us, that draws us closer through these deeds to reach out and understand. And it's that irony that we appreciate.
Okay, thank you. With that, we will close, and thank you very much for your patience and for coming today. Thank you.